And if we go back to Hama, Professor, what I found interesting is that I read that you were actually in Syria in 1982 when the Hama
You've
massacre
done your
took
homework. I
place.
was a Fulbright student. I'd been teaching in Beirut from 79 to 81. I graduated from Swarthmore College and I went to Beirut to teach because I wanted adventure. It was in the middle of civil war. And then I applied for a Fulbright grant and I got it. They just started in Damascus because America hadn't had representation. Um, and so I went to Syria in 81 to
Hmm.
82. And the Hama uprising was during that time. I was living at Medina Jama'iyya at the University of Damascus, in Wahda al-Ula, the first big dormitory on the second floor. And I spent most of my time with the blind students who lived on the first floor. They had special minute grants and they put them on the first floor. And the blind students were kind enough to listen to my terrible Arabic and to correct me, and because nobody was coming to visit them, and they were stuck in their rooms largely. So I would go and just hang out with the blind students, and that's how I began to learn Arabic. But during the Hama uprising,
Hmm.
they were very they spoke to me much more openly than the rest of uh, the Syrian students, because the Mukhabarat left the blind students alone and figured they were not a danger. And so they were much more relaxed with me, and I got to know them well. And one student from Hama lost, I think close to 20 members of his family during the Hama uprising. And everybody was quiet during that period because Syria didn't tell you what was going on. It took a week or so before we began to hear. And then they showed us on TV that these arms were taking away. The terrorists had arms, and they would show us these arm caches all laid out on the floor. But there was so little information that got out. Um, and the American embassy just left us in our dormitories throughout this whole period. Today they would whip you out within 5 seconds, you'd be evacuated. But so then I went to Hama.
You actually went there.
I went there almost just a week after the fighting stopped, and the Syrian regime allowed. I was really surprised. I went with this French guy who had a little Jeep, and he we could drive all around Hama and see the amazing devastation. And it was as if the regime wanted people to come and see it and see this is what happens if you mess with the regime. And it put the fear of God in people. It was a lesson, and it suppressed the Muslim Brotherhood for the next 30 years.
In that brutal crackdown, it was there's different reports. I mean, 10 to 20,000 killed. I mean, I've seen reports as high as 40,000. But the question is, how did Hama become a turning point for Syria under Hafez al-Assad?
It really marked the regime as an Alawite regime. It drew these battle lines very starkly in Syria. So those were, Hama just had everybody scared. And people were tiptoeing around Syria, being very careful not to be seen as a Muslim brother. And that's when you get searched all throughout Syria. They began to build barriers in front of public buildings because you had the first car bombs and so forth. Um, and so this became the modus vivendi.
Did the repression of the regime increase? I mean, were there even more roundups, more arrests, more brutal
Yes.
crackdowns happening since then?
Well, and in the lead up to Hama, there were many executions, and this is when the prisons really took Rifat al-Assad's Sarai Difat went into the prisons and just shot lots of the Muslim brothers. They were executed, and Tadmor prison up in Palmyra became the symbol for evil, the way Sidnaya is today.
Hmm.
Um, and people were kept there for ages in terrible conditions. And there are many prison memoirs of people who got out and wrote about what life was like, and you know, they're pretty miserable.
I think it'd be interesting to kind of hear again, going back to Hama, and when you were driving around seeing the devastation. I mean, what were the biggest things, or what are the biggest things that you remember from that time? I mean, when it
Well,
comes to the destruction, devastation, killings.
well, it was in the center of town, and everything was in ruins. It hadn't been bulldozed yet. It within a month it was bulldozed, and the real, I guess the real memory I have is not of the initial driving through it, which
Mm-hmm.
was pretty stunning, but it was later, a few months later, when I took the Karnak bus. There was one bus company, well, there's a major bus company that would take you. That was the upper class bus company. It would take you from Damascus to Aleppo. And so I went to Aleppo a few months later after having visited in the initial stages. And when you got to Hama, because you had to pass through Hama, um, at that time, everything had changed because all downtown had been bulldozed. And so there were no more broken down buildings and rocks tumbled about. It was all bulldozed and they were going to begin to rebuild. But when the bus reached the outside of Hama, I was talking to a friend who was sitting next to me, and the bus driver asked everybody to be quiet, and he sort of shushed me, and everybody fell quiet in the bus. The music was turned off because there was this blaring, fun music. So the music was turned off, and the entire bus went through Hama. And normally you stop in Hama and you get a drink of water at some cafe or something like that. Everybody gets out and goes to the bathroom, but we didn't stop. The bus went through Hama at a snail's pace. Everybody's staring out the windows in this deep silence, and it was like a memorial service, really, because you could see how horrified and how distraught people were on the bus, as the driver was himself. Um, and it was this moment of silence as you drove by and looked out and saw this very empty space that had been bulldozed and all these lives had been destroyed. Um, and it was a very moving and strange moment.
Do you remember how it affected the morale of the country?
Yes. Um, it everybody distrusted everybody. There was a whispering campaign in the dormitory because I was living in the dormitory with the
Yes,
students,
correct.
and the students began to whisper and say, "Oh, his family had people killed, and he's from Hama," and so students wanted to know, and they would ask these families, but it was all in whispers, and it was the way the dormitory worked is that there was a deity room from Deir ez-Zor, and there was the Darzi room, the Druze rooms where they had Druze students, and you'd always find other Druze. And people hung out according to their town, their religion, and they really, because all their friends were from their town or their religion. It was
Mm-hmm.
rare to go into a room and you find people from different parts of Syria. It was really emblematic of the divisiveness within Syrian society. So people collected according to, well, it was extended family in each of these rooms. And so there was great distrust going from one room to the other, which I could do as an American and a foreigner. Everybody was always
Sure.
very glad to have me come by because it was going to be something new. They would put on the tea on the tea kettle and spoil you. And so I had a very privileged position because I could go
Yeah.
from the dairy room to the Darzi room to the Hama room and make the rounds. But society was very separated, and there was talk about the yatim, the orphans,
The
because there were a
orphans.
lot of orphans that came out, and so the real sense of shame and I guess debauchery of the regime was that the girl orphans were being taken by regime people who would have them as servants, who would use them as servants, really. And this idea that somehow these girls were going to be defiled by regime people. And that was the gossip. And it was a sign, I don't know how true it was, but it was a sign of the deep sense of immorality that pervaded Syrian society at the time, that something very evil was going on, and it was all secret, but it was encapsulated in this sense that these innocent girls were going to be violated. And that, I think, that sense of indecency and immorality pervaded the way people thought about that period.
Was it? Would you look at it as a defining element of the Assad regime?
Yes, the corruption. I mean, people, in many ways, it was a defining element of the secrecy, the anxiety that people felt, the lack of freedom, and that never went away, even though it improved tremendously in the 90s, and then particularly during the first decade of Assad's rule, of the Bashar al-Assad's rule, where people began to feel like there was some opening and things began to change more rapidly. But it never went away. And then after 2011, of course, it just, there was this explosion of sense that it's over, he's going to fall rapidly, and it never happened. And then, of course, once he regained control, there was just real fear, because so many people, the repressiveness of those jails had always been a fairly small group of people who were being tortured and abused. Once the civil war started in 2011, massive amounts of people were beginning to be arrested and go into this gulag of prisons. And we believe that, over 100,000 people have disappeared in those prisons since 2011, which is just a massive number in Syrian society. Whereas before that, there had always been these prison stories. The prisons were grim, and people were being arrested. Of course, there was a big explosion of arrests around the Hama period, when the Muslim Brotherhood were threatening the regime, and then it tapers off. So that sense but it's pervasive fear. And it was always in the back of everybody's mind. And Assad, this dictator was always over your head. You were always thinking, what does Assad think of this? What is his opinion about something? Would this upset the regime? So you just had to constantly, there was a North Star over your head, which was this person. And you're trying to figure out the personality of that person. If you're trying to get ahead in life, you have to figure out what suits the regime, what doesn't suit the regime. It's part of being in a dictatorship where you have to fear, where fear is omnipresent.